Hello, this is Dr. Paul Cottrell, and I'm going to be talking about the important aspects of the operation in Venezuela with the United States taking the Venezuelan oil and how that dovetails into the refining capacity of the United States. Now, it's important to understand that the oil that Venezuela produces is slightly different than what the United States produces. There's these different densities of oil. But before we go into the details of the refining capacity of PADD, of the different locations where the refining takes place in the United States, please help support the work that I do by making sure you share the links, ask your social media to follow me, and make sure that you subscribe to all my different channels. I have YouTube, Brighteon, Bitchute, and Rumble, Substack, TikTok, X, GETTR. You can also follow me on Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon. So please sign up. And if you like the work that I do, if you would please donate, you can donate through Stripe, PayPal, or Buy Me a Coffee. And better yet, you can get the great products that I offer. I have ebooks, supplements, and course material. So take a look at what I offer. I also have a new feature that's free for the public called Paper under Broadcast. So under Broadcast, you can watch the live streams, the archival audio for my podcasts, and Paper is news that's generated that you may want to read just to get abreast to some breaking top news. So that's a great way to get informed. But take a look at the great products that I offer because they will help for you to slow down the aging process and to get healthy. So before we go into the details of the Petroleum Administration for Defense Districts, PADD, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Now I want to talk about this protocol, this anti-aging core protocol that I have. The foundation of it, I'm going to be very brief. The foundation of it is the multivitamin, which is easy to digest, and these multivitamins help with enzymatic activity. The probiotic, which will improve your gut biome and allow for your immune system to be improved at the gut level, bring down inflammation, improve brain function, improve metabolism. That's the foundation. And on top of that foundation, there are 4 pillars. Max 35, Max 14, or Cleanse. They're at different parts per million. Max 14 is 14 parts per million. Max 35 is 35 parts per million, and Cleanse is 30 parts per million. They're at different price points based on your affordability, but take a teaspoon a day every day, switch it in your mouth, gargle about 20 seconds, then swallow it. What this will do is improve your oral cavity, help to maintain your mucosal barrier, and help the health of your epithelial cells in your oral pharynx to boost up your immune system. The second pillar is a very strong antioxidant. It's 1,000 times stronger than vitamin C. That's C60. You can get it in extra virgin olive oil, MCT coconut oil, and avocado oil. You can get it in a 2 ounce, a 4 ounce, or an 8 ounce configuration. And by taking a teaspoon a day every day, you're going to slow down the oxidation, boost up the health of your mitochondria. You'll have more energy. You'll improve your immune system, your endocrine system. You'll help with your cardiovascular system because you're reducing the concentration of oxidized LDL. So you're reducing plaque formation by soaking up free radicals and bringing down inflammation. And at the neuron level, you're helping the health of your mitochondria so you can produce more neurotransmitters. So this will allow you to actually improve the health of the neural network that you have so you can think faster and have better memory. So please go to my store, take a teaspoon a day every day, preferably on an empty stomach. You can get it in a 2 ounce, a 4 ounce, or an 8 ounce configuration. The third pillar, lignans. This will help with your immune system and endocrine system, bring down inflammation, soak up free radicals. Turmeric will help to bring down inflammation and soak up free radicals. And ashwagandha root will help to control your cortisol levels and your blood glucose levels, bring down inflammation. When you stack these together, this is a very powerful stack to help with your cardiovascular health and boost up your immune system. And by bringing down inflammation with this stack, you're also helping with brain function because you're creating the microenvironment to maintain and improve the health of your neurons. And the last pillar of the core anti-aging protocol is Boomer Boost. Just take it every day. It's a powder. This is a month's supply. And this will help to improve your musculature, rev up your energy levels and your metabolism. You're going to be able to control your A1C levels. You're going to be able to lose weight if you want to. You're going to have better brain function. It'll get rid of that brain fog. You're going to be able to concentrate. You'll be able to sleep better. You'll have a steady burn of energy throughout the day, no spiking. It'll help with your cardiovascular health. And over time, you're going to notice that you're going to have more vitality and you're aging slower. This will help to break down that inflammation, soak up those free radicals, and it stacks really well with this protocol. So again, the protocol, very simple. The foundation, the multivitamin, and the probiotic. The first pillar, on top of that foundation, the Max 35, Max 14, or Cleanse. Take it every day, teaspoon a day. Turmeric, the C60 is the second pillar. So you take the C60, teaspoon a day. The third pillar is the turmeric, ashwagandha, and lignans to bring down that inflammation. And the fourth pillar, Boomer Boost. Help with the cardiovascular, help with brain function, help with musculature, help with energy and your cellular metabolism. Do that every day, you're going to slow down the aging process. All right, with that, please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Use discount 5, all caps, discount 5, and you get $5 off any order. All right. Now, PADD is Petroleum Administration for Defense Districts. So the United States is divided up into different districts. All right. So PADD 1 up through PADD 5. PADD 1 is divided into 3 mini districts. So PADD 1A, PADD 1B, PADD 1C. PADD 1 is East Coast. PADD 1A is the upper part of the East Coast. So you're talking about Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. PADD 1B, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland. All right. And then PADD 1C, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So you have the East Coast PADD. Then you have PADD 2, which is the West, the Midwest. So now you're talking about North Dakota, South Dakota, Michigan. I'm not going to read them all, but, Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee. All right. So you have the Midwest is PADD 2. PADD 3, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, North, New Mexico. You have New Mexico also. But, you have a couple other states too. But the point here is you have PADD 3, which is the Gulf Coast. PADD 4 is the Rocky Mountains. All right. So you have Montana, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado, Wyoming. All right. So that's the Rocky Mountains. And then PADD 5 is the West Coast. So all the other states. Now, PADD 5 also includes Alaska and Hawaii. So PADD 5, West Coast, PADD 3, Gulf Coast, PADD 4, Rocky Mountains, PADD 2, Midwest, and PADD 1, East Coast. Now, why is this important? Different areas have fine-tuned their refining capacity of oil. And so their feedstock into the refinery has to be a certain percentage of light and heavy crude. All right. So I'm going to give you some stats on this. So this is important because it's heavy crude that is coming out from Venezuela. Most of our oil production is light sweet crude, not heavy sour crude. All right. And the sourness or sweetness is based on the sulfur content. So what's coming out of Venezuela is heavy crude. Now, for the Gulf Coast, and most of it is in Louisiana and Texas, all right, for this PADD3. This is where the heavy crude is mostly refined. It's in this region here. Now, it makes sense to have it being imported from Venezuela into the Gulf Coast because the shipping costs would be cheaper. If you take that light sweet crude, I'm sorry, not light sweet crude, the heavy sour crude from Venezuela, the heavy crude from Venezuela, and it's shipped through the ocean into the Gulf, right? And you wanted to port it to the Midwest, which is another major refining area for heavy crude, you would have transportation costs. So it's important, the dynamic between Venezuela and Canada, because Canada also imports heavy crude to the United States. So I should say export heavy crude to the United States. The United States imports heavy crude from Canada. So you have this from the tar sands and this heavy crude from Canada. Well, that distribution typically goes to PADD2, while the distribution from other regions goes to PADD3. Okay? Bulk of the refining is in PADD3, but quite a bit of it is in PADD2. So there's this dynamic between Canada and Venezuela that's really important to understand here. And keep in mind, you bring in the heavy crude from Venezuela, you have transportation costs to go to the different pads if you need heavy crude. Now remember, these refineries are fine-tuned for a certain percentage of light sweet and heavy, all right? Because not all oil is equal. Not all oil in the same field is equal. There's changes in the actual composition of the sulfur content and the viscosity. All right, so Texas and Louisiana are major refining areas for heavy crude. Okay. Now PADD2 is getting a significant amount of heavy crude from Canadian oil sands and diluted bitumen. Okay. Now, so you have PADD2 mostly coming from Canada. Now, you remember that tariffs was one of Canada's negotiating tactics. Well, we'll just shut off our crude oil to you, the heavy crude, and the cost of energy would go up in the Midwest. Now, you have to also remember, once the refining takes place and you turn it into other products like gasoline or other lighter products, you still have transportation costs. So it's better from a cost point of view that wherever the refining is taking place and those products are being produced, those downstream products that are being produced from the crude oil, your distribution should be in the PADD region to lower the cost. If you make gasoline, let's say, or if you make a downstream product in PADD3, it doesn't make much sense to ship it to Maine, right? That's the whole point of the PADD regions. But this also brings up the issue that we should have a better distribution to be able to ship across different pads to not be bottlenecked because of some issue with tariffs, some issue with the country, some issue with the quality of the crude. All right. And this is another reason why they wanted to have the Keystone Pipeline to be coming in and coming all the way down to the Gulf. Because if you could take the heavy crude, most of the heavy crude is in Louisiana and Texas for refining. From Canada, you'd be able to pipe it right into the Gulf. So that was another part of the reason why the Keystone Pipeline was so important. And what is interesting is I haven't heard anything about that with the new administration with Trump. Okay, so with PADD 2, most of it's coming from Canada. And Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota are major refining areas. So Indiana, Illinois, so Indiana, Illinois, and Minnesota. Okay, now you have PADD 1, which is the East Coast. Now this doesn't use that much heavy crude at all. And there's some capacity in Delaware for the East Coast, but that's declining. So that's heavy crude doesn't really get processed in PADD 1 that much. Now in PADD 5, which is the West Coast, Alaska and Hawaii, PADD 5, smaller scale, PADD 5 processes the heavy and medium crudes, and it's primarily in California. And some of this heavy and medium crude is actually coming from the California fields, but it also gets some imports. And then the Rocky Mountains, which is PADD 4, smaller scale, and it's reliant on Canadian heavy crude. So the Canadian heavy crude is coming into PADD 4 and PADD 2. Now, in terms of heavy crude, PADD 3 is the dominant player, and then PADD 2. Now, if you have, now this is the important feature here, if you're getting heavy sour crude from Venezuela into PADD 3 and it's being processed, and there is some sort of ability to ship the downstream products to other regions, especially into the Midwest, you no longer need Canada. So Canada's leveraging power with Texas can be diminished if you can keep the transportation costs down, either through transit on the rail or pipeline. But if we were 100% dependent on Venezuela for processing heavy crude, plus any heavy crude that we produce in the United States, which is not that much, and we didn't get anything from Canada, most likely Midwest energy costs would go up. Okay. Now, let's take a look at some of the let's get into the barrels here. U.S. total operable capacity for this atmospheric crude distillation capacity remains at about 18.4 million barrels per day. 90% of U.S. crude imports are heavier than typical U.S. produced shale oil. So 90% of the imports that are coming in are heavy. Now, PADD 3, so typically Louisiana and Texas, that typically refines about 3 to 4 million barrels per day of heavy grades, or it has that capacity. It has the capacity to do that. Midwest refineries can also handle a significant amount of Canadian heavy crude, especially through the pipelines. Okay. Now, based on percentages, PADD 3, so Texas and Louisiana, about 80 to 90% of its capacity is optimized for heavy sour crude. So 80 to 90% of its capacity is fine-tuned for heavy crude. And that PADD3 holds 34 to 35% of the total U.S. atmospheric distillation capacity. Now, PADD2, so the Midwest, has 60 to 75% that optimization. So its capacity, 60 to 75% of it is for heavy crude. It's optimized for, so about 25% to 40% is for lighter crude. So you can see here that with PADD3, so the Gulf, it's heavily involved and focused on heavy crude, while 60 to 75% is focused on heavy crude for PADD2. And you can kind of see this, why Venezuela and South America is so important to the United States, because of the refining capacity in PADD3, and why Canada's crude is so important because of the refining capacity in the Midwest. Now, PADD5, West Coast, 40 to 60% optimized for heavy crude. Okay, so it's a little less than PADD2. East Coast, 20 to 40% is optimized for heavy. So 80 to 60% is for lighter crudes. Rocky Mountains, PADD4, 50 to 70% is optimized and heavily reliant on Canadian heavy crude. You got to remember, the Canadian heavy crude is different than the Venezuelan heavy crude, or even the California heavy crude. All right. So these refineries have fine-tuned the process, and that costs a lot of money to do that. So this is part of the reason why it's so important. Okay. So you have, the point here is that you have regions that are different, that can process different types of crude, and their refining capacity is based on certain feedstocks. How much of it is light? How much of it is heavy crude? And that will allow them to make their different products. So if you start shipping a bunch of heavy crude to the east, their refining capacity isn't fine-tuned for that. So there's going to be a lot of waste, a lot of problems with the refining. And the same thing with PADD3. It's heavily fine-tuned for heavy crude, but if you sent a lot of light crude to it, it wouldn't do very well. So different regions can process efficiently different types of crude, and that it's coming from different regions. Gulf Coast is coming mostly from other regions that have heavier crude. And the Midwest and the Rocky Mountains is coming from Canada. Now, with the United States coming in and trying to, I guess the question would be, why did the United States go into Venezuela? Well, that's not just a simple surface answer to that question. There's many layers to this. First of all, we need the heavy crude for PADD3 that Venezuela has. We also have created a national strategic doctrine where we're going to be putting some more focus in Central America and South America, partially because of the drug running, partially because of China and Russia putting influence in the region. And you have Panama Canal, where we need our military and our economy to have free passage through Panama. Well, you have Colombia and Venezuela that are really important in those regions. So if you can put your influence in that area, if the United States can put our influence in South America, control the freedom of navigation for our military and for the economy, for goods to pass between the canal. And you're building better relationships in the region. You're going to be able to push out Russia and China. Now, why is pushing out Russia and China really important? Well, China is trying to have influence, create influence in Panama. They're trying to create influence in Venezuela. They need the crude. China needs the crude because they have tuned their refineries for heavy crude. So we're diverting, they're getting their oil also from Iran and Saudi Arabia, but we've diverted now a decent percentage, an important percentage of heavy crude away from China and towards PADD3. So it affects China's energy imports. It also reduces the influence of China in Venezuela. China's already started to have relationships with Brazil, with satellites and way stations that are Earth-based in Brazil. Well, that's going to be a problem for the United States, especially for missile defense. So we have to build better relationships in South America to stop the drug running, to improve goods that we can sell to South America, because there's lots of infrastructure to be rebuilt. There's lots of raw materials that they have that we can import and use. So you're talking about lumber and important metals that need to be refined, and the oil. Now, it takes time to build that up. So we're not talking about something that's going to be an immediate thing during the Trump administration. You're talking about multiple decades to build up refining capacity, to build up mining capacity, to build up, fine tune and build out more infrastructure for just crude oil in the United States. But there's a lot of opportunity if the United States, in terms of business, has a lot of opportunity to engage and create stability in South America. And they have raw materials that we can import. Plus, if we can control that region, we're stopping or curtailing those resources being shipped to China or to Russia. All right. This is important because this is one of the first pieces that are going to be needed to fight against China if China goes and tries to invade Taiwan. If you can control around the Panama Canal, if you can control the crude that is going to China, you are chokeholding them. Now, a lot of people would say, well, what's the big deal if China takes Taiwan? Taiwan is a flashpoint because all of the other island chains are connected to it. That first level of island chains are connected to Taiwan. So China taking Taiwan is going to cause instability in the region with the Philippines, with Japan, with the archipelago for Hawaii, for Alaska. A lot of people don't realize Hawaii is not just 5 islands. It's 137 islands. Wake up. And it goes all the way towards the west of the Pacific. And you have the huge island chain coming right off of Alaska. So if China starts to move eastward and they have a blue water navy, they have prevented freedom of navigation through the 9-dash line. So goods can't go through, on top of them trying to control energy reserves that are in the ocean in that region. There's just a new oil field that was discovered just off of Vietnam. So there's lots of natural gas and oil in the basin down in the ocean. All right, so there's lots of energy there. But it's not just energy, it's also freedom of navigation for goods. And that's going to be a major problem for us. So, and then as their blue water navy starts to have more capability, it will start to erode the hegemonic power of the allied nations. And now the second and third island chains are at risk. China will be more belligerent, especially if they're successful with Taiwan. So this is why it's so important. You got to choke hold them, and you got to make sure that they don't get that oil. All right, now we have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, so we can probably prevent them from selling to China if a war broke out. Controlling Iran is really important to prevent them from selling crude to China. And if we can prevent Russia from sending crude to China, then China doesn't have the energy that it needs. So this is what Trump's doing is not just for energy for the United States. This is a long, multiple move in a hot war that you don't even realize it's a hot war now. But it's happening. World War III is now. It's not maybe next year, maybe in 6 months. It's now. So I think Trump is doing a good thing with getting into Venezuela. Now, the reason why they don't really care if it's a democracy or if they bring back the Nobel Prize winner is because all they care about right now is the stability to keep the flow of crude, to prevent it from going to China and have it to go to the United States. Now, we have a strategic reserve that needs to be filled back because Biden reduced it. Now, my understanding is the strategic reserve doesn't want the heavy crude, it wants the lighter crude or a medium crude. So one proposal is that you take the heavy crude from Venezuela and you either sell it or you process it and sell the downstream products. And some of that profit would be used to actually buy the light sweet crude or the medium crude to put into strategic reserve. Because my understanding is the heavy crude doesn't go into strategic reserve because it's too hard to pump it out of the reserve. It's not as efficient, let's put it that way. So, but maybe I'm wrong, but the thing is that I think they prefer the medium or light crude. So it's possible that we use the profits to actually help to fill our strategic reserve. Another thing that seems odd to me, and I don't understand why, but Congress, my understanding is that Congress has not given the approval to actually refill the strategic reserve. So this is part of the reason how Trump can get around it by taking the crude, sell it, or some of the products that come from it, use that money to actually purchase oil that could go into the strategic reserve without asking Congress for additional appropriations. So hopefully this gives a better understanding of the dynamics of going into Venezuela. It's not as simple as, well, we just want the oil. Well, we bring in the oil, we reduce the leverage from Canada. All right. If we bring in the oil, less oil is going to China. If we have some sort of business relationship with Venezuela, then we're going to be able to put more pressure onto Colombia, maybe even put pressure on Brazil. Remember, China was really upset when Trump did the operation and extracted the leader of Venezuela, Maduro, because they are using Venezuela as a vassal state. They've invested in Venezuela for projects, and they're concerned they're not going to get paid back. And that was the reason why President Xi wanted to understand what the effects to their economy will be if they're shut out of Venezuela. Not just with the oil, but with the projects that they've invested in. So the banks have some sort of exposure to what Trump just did. So Trump just hit China with with energy, and also hit them in terms of their overall economy and the stability of their banking industry. So it was a smart move. And this is the reason why I'm saying is that Venezuela is one of the pawn pieces of this kinetic war that's already taking place. So let's take a look. All right, so that's a good overview of some of the things that I've been talking about here. Now, what I want to do is play some videos that I saw yesterday. Okay. Global risks. Yeah, this is a good one.
Someday, my friends will come. I'd like to talk today about the recent events in Venezuela, specifically from an economic point of view, and who are the real winners and losers. The U.S., for a change, is firmly in the driver's seat and master of its own destiny and hemisphere. The economic story here also goes well beyond oil, too, although that's what has gotten most of the attention. Venezuela is a veritable gold mine of other natural resources like rare earth minerals, lumber, bauxite, the primary source of aluminum, natural gas, and more. But the biggest loser of all isn't China or Russia, it's Canada. After last weekend's events, not only is Canada losing its biggest crude customer, but it's also losing its only real leverage in trade talks with the United States. Hi, I'm E.J. Antoni for the Daily Signal. I'd like to talk today about the recent events in Venezuela, specifically from an economic point of view, and who are the real winners and losers. Let's start with the obvious. The Venezuela operation is a win for America and the Venezuelan people. American consumers and businesses will benefit from lower prices, while oil companies have a chance for bigger profits. Venezuelans will benefit from increased investment, jobs, and profits in their country as well. This is why their stock market jumped 50, 60, 70, 80% after the US takeover. And if we recall that economic security is also national security, then the new order in South America also simultaneously supports US national security, while undermining our greatest rival, China. In war, dependable access to oil is as important as dependable access to kinetic arms. Access to ample, reliable flows of oil represents a key strategic interest. Removing one such flow from the Chinese sphere of influence and bringing it into our own is tremendous progress toward this goal. But the biggest loser of all isn't China or Russia, it's Canada. Western Canada sends over 4 million barrels a day of heavy crude to American refiners who are equipped to handle this type of oil. But now, with access to the massive flows
What's important, though, is most of that is going to PADD3 and some of it's going to PADD4. All right? Now, you can't have it all being produced in PADD2 and PADD4, right? Because the cost to ship it to, let's say, the southern states or to PADD1, that those products that are being made, you have shipping costs. So that's why you have certain regions producing certain types of crude to try to keep the prices down. Right? So you can't 100% supplant Canada with Venezuela unless you fine tune the refineries. And remember, the crude that's coming from Canada is slightly different than Venezuela, even though it's heavy. Right? So you have to fine tune the process. So that's going to cost money. But not just that. If you were trying to supplant all of the crude from Canada with just Venezuelan crude, you have the shipping costs of that crude all the way to PADD2 and PADD4 for processing. So the cost to actually make downstream products has gone up because you have shipping costs. So it's not as simple as 100% supplanting Canada, but it does reduce the leverage because you got to remember most of our heavy crude capacity is in PADD3. So it could put a major dent and a major leveraging point against Canada. But he doesn't go into as detail of this fine tuning between PADD3 and PADD2 with the heavy crude and the cost for shipping if you were to process heavy crude from Venezuela into PADD2. Because that would increase the transportation costs.
Which is similar to the Canadian flavor. The US no longer needs to rely on Canada to keep the refineries on the Gulf of America running at full capacity.
Right.
Instead, the oil shipments that previously went to China are already being redirected to American refiners, tens of millions of barrels worth, just days after Maduro's capture. And while the United States is paying full market price for that oil, don't be surprised if oil prices start coming down even further because of this redirection. After all, increasing supply puts downward pressure on prices. As American investment rebuilds Venezuela's severely neglected oil infrastructure, we can expect production and exports to the US to only increase, simultaneously benefiting the American and Venezuelan people. That's why this is such a massive economic win for American families and businesses who will benefit from lower prices courtesy of more energy supplies. And since energy affects the price of everything else in an economy, lower prices for products like gasoline will put downward pressure on countless other prices, providing relief after 4 years of inflation under the Biden administration. Consider when you go to a grocery store, how much of the price of food you're buying is dependent on energy prices. First off, farmers and ranchers are fueling their tractors and other vehicles with diesel and gas. They're also using synthetic fertilizers created with natural gas. But how did the gallon of milk or the carton of eggs or the bag of bread get to the grocery store in the first place? It got there on a truck, fueled by oil. What I'm getting at here is that we seriously underestimate just how much the price of energy affects everything we do and everything we buy. Bring down energy prices and you put downward pressure on prices throughout the economy. That's a win for American consumers and businesses alike. And US control of Venezuela is also a second chance for jilted American oil companies to again profit from nearly 1/5 of the world's proven oil reserves. Years ago, those American companies poured investment into Venezuela to essentially modernize the entire industry there. For their troubles, these oil firms had their physical property confiscated and their intellectual property copied as the communists nationalized Venezuelan oil. Of course, communist rule there was a disaster, as it has been everywhere, and the oil industry languished as infrastructure decayed, investment lagged, and production fell well below its potential. Venezuela pumps much less oil today than they did a quarter century ago. But this is poised to reverse. Venezuela will now assuredly receive billions of dollars of investment from American oil companies, many of whom are champing at the bit to regain access to the largest reserves in the world. That will mean a windfall of jobs and income for the Venezuelan people, all of which could have been Canada's, bringing us back to the story of the biggest economic loser here. It didn't have to be this way for the 51st state. But instead of welcoming oil and gas investment from the United States and building valuable infrastructure like pipelines, Canada has preferred to prioritize far left causes and an anti-energy agenda. After last weekend's events, not only is Canada losing its biggest crude customer, but it's also losing its only real leverage in trade talks with the United States. This is an economic reality that very few professional pundits seem to have grasped. To be clear, the flood of cheap Venezuelan crude will not arrive in the US overnight. It will take time, years in fact, to rebuild Venezuela's oil infrastructure and really ramp up production to replace most Canadian crude imports. But the writing is on the wall. The US, for a change, is firmly in the driver's seat and master of its own destiny and hemisphere. The economic story here also goes well beyond oil, too, although that's what has gotten most of the attention. Venezuela is a veritable gold mine of other natural resources like rare earth minerals, lumber, bauxite, the primary source of aluminum, natural gas, and more. Canada just lost not only its leverage with oil, but just about every other one of its exports, too. Since the Canadian economy is much more dependent on exports than the US economy is, and since nearly all Canadian exports come to the US, while relatively few of ours go to Canada, the slowdown in trade between the two countries has very unequal effects. In short, this has been very harmful to Canada and will be devastating in the long run. But it's little more than a speed bump here in America. President Donald Trump has effectively barred the door on Canada, and the latter will have few alternatives to completely opening every one of its markets to free and fair competition. Of course, Canada can always choose to fall further into irrelevance and economic impoverishment by stubbornly continuing to snub American manufacturers, farmers, and workers. Let me close by saying that if the Monroe Doctrine warned Europeans to stay out of the Western Hemisphere, and the Roosevelt Corollary established American intervention therein, then the Trump Corollary has put a finer and more economic point on the matter that's best summed up in two words: America first. Right. I'm J. Antoni with the Daily Signal.
Dr. Antoni is pretty good with this. So another thing that's important to understand is that there's a byproduct when you start to break down these heavy crudes. That byproduct is called pet coke, or just coke. But pet coke is used also in aluminum smelting. So by having more heavy crude coming in, our aluminum manufacturing will go up, which is important for a war effort and also important for industrial manufacturing, because we have a lot of aluminum as part of our industrial manufacturing. Now, there's something called met coke, which is metallurgic coke, that is for steel making, which is different, all right? But this heavy crude isn't just helping our oil industry and some of the typical byproducts that come from the oil industry, gasoline and all these other byproducts, but also a major source for smelting aluminum. So just keep that in mind, that Dr. Antoni didn't mention. Okay, now I'm going to play one more. It was something last night that I saw. What was it today? All right. This is the Center for Strategic and International Studies: Venezuela Oil Sanctions and the U.S. Strategy to Reshape Global Energy.
Oil steal or oil deal? Welcome to today's episode of Energy Shots, where we've got a lot to discuss. Kevin, we're back. Not even a week ago.
It's amazing to think it's been fewer than 7 days since U.S. forces extracted former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and all the conversations we've been having. Really, a lot of things have happened since then.
They have, and I want to talk both today about what has happened and where we think this may go, right? So the U.S. military, and under the direction of the president over the last week, has been on a seizure campaign. We're grabbing, the Navy SEALs are grabbing oil tankers out of the North Atlantic, Russian flag, carrying sanctioned oil. We seized Maduro early in the morning last Saturday using Delta Force. And the president is imposing his will, and perhaps the will of the United States on the country of Venezuela. And he has not been shy about the fact that oil is at the heart of this story.
And really, there's two threads to that story about oil. One is the existing barrels and their disposition. And the second is the investment in future barrels, production in Venezuela that could come out with a lot of investment in the near term.
Well, our audience has heard this a lot. You and I have discussed this before. We have to start with the fact that Venezuela holds the largest claimed proven reserves of oil globally. The other major candidates in that, the only other competitor in that game really is Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, on a reserves to production ratio, though, of course, Saudi Arabia has a different multiple because they're doing a significant amount of oil out of the ground. And what we have in Venezuela with 300 billion barrels of reserves is less than 1 million, with an M, barrels per day of production. That's down from more than 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, Petróleos de Venezuela, the state oil company, envisioned getting above 6.5 million barrels per day over the course of the coming decades. And so a lot of geologic potential, not very much actual, and that's why we've seen relatively little movement in oil prices. We've seen a lot of interest, though, in where this could go.
Yeah, to me, the geopolitical story here is actually much larger than the immediate market story. But what I think the president is saying, we're going to rebuild the industry. The United States, and when he says we, he means the United States government, it looks like at this time, is going to help and then benefit from the revitalization of the Venezuelan oil industry. A second opening, I think, given what we saw in the 1990s post-nationalization. They brought in private companies, a lot of them from the United States, and international operators under joint ventures to grow oil production out of Venezuela back into the 2000s and early 2000s. After all that was renegotiated, expropriated, that's when you saw the industry fail.
Well, yeah, that and of course the collapse in oil prices that followed the Great Recession, which helped to undermine the use of PDVSA's proceeds for non-oil purposes, using the national oil company as a piggy bank instead of putting the money back into the ground. But you mentioned actually a couple very important concepts. On Sunday shows, Secretary of State Marco Rubio used the words guarantees and conditions to describe incentives that would be necessary for U.S. investment. One of the open questions to be uncovered over coming weeks is what those will look like, how will they be structured, and whether or not they would motivate oil company investment.
Well, let's talk a little bit right now about what could that actually look like, right? So, we have a ton of oil in the ground. We know that political stability, which they're pursuing by kind of threatening the existing remnants of the Maduro's regime and saying, like, our way or the highway, or our way or the extradition flight. But let's talk about what the market would need to see, right? What is the characteristic of Venezuelan oil that's most important for people to understand when we think about growing production out of the country?
Well, it's mostly that it's heavy and sour. It's a high density and a high sulfur content, which means that it needs more processing, not just in the refineries that buy it, but also it needs more processing before it can be sent to those.
This is really important.
That means fairly significant capital investments.
This is really important. This is what I was talking about with the share of the global coking capacity. All right. Heavy crude produces a byproduct that is high dense carbon. And that's pet coke. And pet coke is used for smelting for aluminum, but also to help with other processing within downstream products from petrochemical. So the coking capacity, the ability to process this coke, which is the byproduct of processing heavy crude. US, 41%. China, only 13%. 10% from India. Russia, only 5.7%. Saudi Arabia, only 4.0%. United States, by far, can process the byproduct of this heavy crude. And there are benefits, industrial benefits from this. This is why I keep on saying the power density of oil compared to wind, solar, you get so many other byproducts that can be used for heavy industrial and also agricultural that you would not get from solar generation or wind generation. Because when you're drilling for oil, you're also getting natural gas. Well, natural gas can be processed and create fertilizer. You can't do that with solar. Solar doesn't help agriculture. Solar doesn't provide the coke that is needed for the smelting of aluminum. So to make aluminum would be even more expensive if you had a solar panelized society or wind power. See, so these tree-hugging sustainability types out there don't realize that there are a lot of byproducts that are coming from oil industry that actually give us the modern society that we have, that you would not have in a solar paneled world. How do you get petrol coke, pet coke, to make aluminum if you have a solar panel society? How do you do it? Oh, you would have to still use oil. And the cost to use the aluminum would be even higher because you're reducing the actual use of oil, and the refineries would start to go out of business. And then all of a sudden to be able to make the coke, the pet coke, would be astronomical, and the cost to make aluminum would be astronomical. So the point here is that capacity to be able to process this heavy crude, we are far and away above everybody else on the playing field. And that gives us military prowess and economic prowess. So what Trump is doing here isn't just overthrowing, Maduro, but it's setting in motion a major boom in industry and in agriculture, on top of setting the playing field for the war with China. This chart's really important. Coke capacity.
The growth that's being talked about. And those capital investments will depend on stability and the structure of that transit.
Venezuela, or are we also talking about capital investments so that the global market can absorb more of this heavy oil?
Well, both, actually, and I think that's where this slide comes in. So timely, Joseph, how you've done that. So if we look over here, what do we got? We've got the share of global coking capacity. That is the ability to process this heavy, dense oil in refineries in destination countries. By country, the share, 41% of global coking capacity last year resides in the United States, close to Venezuela. Not even close. The next number 2 is China, and then India behind it, Russia, Saudi Arabia. So where is this oil going to go if we have a significant incremental production growth? You probably are going to at some point need significant incremental refinery capacity growth. Right now, though, there is capacity, and I think we'll talk about that in a moment.
Yeah, so if you think about, I want to talk about the long term and then talk about the immediate. And in the long term, if you need to expand this kind of coking capacity so that the world needs more or can use more of this heavy oil, the places where you might look to build it are going to be the United States, China, and India. And given that you have this capacity in China and India, this explains why under the sanctions regime, the sort of paltry flows out of Venezuela, they've been going to these two countries.
Well, yeah, and also China had both equity investments in oil as well as debt repayment oil barrels that were delivered from Venezuela. But when you get right down to it,
Right.
barrels are
So when Trump goes into Venezuela, he's basically shutting off the repayment package to China. And this is the reason why China forced the banks to understand, the companies to understand what their exposure was to what Trump just did by taking Maduro and the oil wells. This coking capacity is super important for a war effort. Super important because it allows for heavy industry and shipbuilding. This is why I said that Venezuela is the pawn in World War III.
Stress barrels find markets, usually at a discount for the selling country. But here in the United States, we spent tens of billions of dollars to sour up and heavy up our refinery kit to be able to process the kind of oil.
So this is all coming out of PADD3. So this is out of the Gulf, all right? PADD3. So it's processing the heavy crude. All right. And all right, so you got Mexico, Canada, Venezuela, and other. So Venezuela heavy sour in the Gulf Coast in terms of crude imports to the United States. So it looks like Mexico was sending a lot. This is back in 15. He's covering up the recent data here. It actually has been going down, though. But that's probably well, it started really going down during COVID, and then it's been kind of flatlined since. Probably because of the light crude that's coming out of our shale production.
And what you have here is PADD3. PADD3 is the Gulf Coast. So using the EIA's Petroleum Area Defense District designations, PADD3 reflects where most of the refinery capacity is in the United States, the center of it, and heavy sour crude imports as gauged by the EIA. What we're looking at is the total volume from 4 basic regions. And so Mexico, which produces a heavy sour crude called Maya, which has been in decline over the years. Canada, which has a lot of heavy sour oil from the oil sands, which has been growing over the years. And Venezuela in the yellow. And what you can see is at the onset of January 2019, petroleum sanctions on Venezuela show the Venezuela fraction going to 0. Red is the rest of the world, the other heavy sour sources. And what you can see over time is that even when Venezuela starts to come back in November of 2022, when former President Joe Biden created some sanctions relief, the expansion takes us back to maybe halfway of where we were at peak. So what happened in those refineries? What were they running instead of the heavy sour crude? They had the equipment and the kit to process it, but the price they had to pay to get it, the limited supply that they had available, but they were running other things. One of those other things, when you come from between here and here, includes Russian crude, which of course became problematic itself in 2022. So what you were looking for is the refineries that are equipped to optimally and efficiently process this heavy crude to high value products that we all use, gasoline, diesel fuel, other things, lubricants. They are looking for these barrels, and these barrels maybe
it's very interesting.
And one of the things,
as Venezuela started to reduce its production and the economic and the political stability of Venezuela was starting to falter and it became more socialistic, our reliance started to go up with Canada for that heavy crude. But Mexico was really important because they were close to PADD3. Because this chart is based on imports for PADD3, not PADD2.
we've seen in reporting on this issue, in political statements, is concerns about the conflict between increasing Venezuelan production and imports into the United States because we've got the refining capacity to absorb it, and both Canadian resources and domestic oil production. How much is that, in your view, is a real conflict that producers in the United States and Canada are going to be thinking about?
Well, downstream refiners are definitely going to be interested in having more heavy sour available. It either means that they'll have an opportunity to source more, or perhaps they can exert more price pressure on other suppliers, including Canada. But then there's the question of what additional barrels means to the oil price,
right,
which is now at about $60 a barrel. And there's a lot of producers in the United States who say, wait a second, if you're adding more oil to a market that is already looking oversupplied, that's not that good for us. Now, in terms of oil quality relative to refinery complexity, which is what we've been talking about, of course, there are different barrels from different places. The U.S. light sweet barrels going to export are not necessarily in direct competition over the short term with the heavy sour barrels that could come in. But generally speaking, expanding the slate of petroleum globally, no matter what grade you add, is going to bring prices down, all other things being equal. And adding heavy sour barrels is going to create new opportunities for the downstream.
Right, correct. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what this might actually look like. Whoop, excuse me. What's that? I got, so animated about this issue that the animations have betrayed me, Kevin.
This is how you can tell this isn't being produced by AI. For those of you watching at home, this is authentic. That is a real Joseph. This is a real Kevin.
So I think here's the concern, right? So folks will look at this situation and say, the U.S. is taking this oil. We're using it for our own benefit. It's not going to benefit the Venezuelan people. It might cause conflicts with producers domestically. It might create problems for the Canadian market. Let's actually talk about what this might look like. You and I have worked up a scenario, kind of roughly looking at what has been happening to distressed Venezuelan barrels to date. And if you were to bring those back toward market prices, if sanctions were to be relieved over time because the U.S. is confident that the Venezuelan government is acting in accord with its goals, what might that turn into? Walk us through the scenarios.
Well, Joseph, this gets very interesting because it starts on January 6th when the president puts on Truth Social that the U.S. is going to receive between 30 and 50 million Venezuelan barrels for sale and imported it into the United States. And then the next day, the Department of Energy and the Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, come out and say this is going to continue indefinitely. The U.S. is going to be marketing and selling above board the barrels that were previously sanctioned. And so through a combination of both military might running a quarantine on the exports of those barrels via sanctioned shadow vessels, as well as economic force projection, effectively putting a sanction in place that forces these distressed barrels into discounted sales to markets of last resort, you have this ability to lift the price for those distressed barrels, selling them through conventional means through sanctions relief. So let's assume on the left-hand side, these distressed barrels, 400,000 maybe going to China, for example, at $30 a barrel, just a conversation point, not necessarily an actual price, generates $12 million per day in revenues. And so Venezuela is currently taking that in this scenario.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, those barrels could be sold at something closer to the market price for a heavy sour grade, maybe $55 a barrel over a medium term, now you're generating $22 million a day. And suddenly the very same number of barrels create more dollars. Those dollars can go into an escrow fund for shared U.S. and Venezuelan purposes, which the president did outline. The Secretary of State and Energy have outlined in ensuing days. And Venezuela could
that escrow is potentially going to help buy crude that's lighter and put it in our strategic reserves, while Venezuela gets the other half. That is scenario 2.
So essentially the mechanism of action here is to be able to change the price of the barrels by changing the sanctions circumstances, and while also maintaining strict controls over the disposition of barrels from Venezuela to enable this.
So, if you change the political story and you bring more of this oil into what I'll say is the sort of the market-driven pricing regime as opposed to the sanctions-driven pricing regime, you'd see higher sales values on these barrels, more revenue associated with them. And then one of the challenges, this happens in the corporate world, it happens to the federal government, is when you have more revenue, it goes away quickly. But we've even sketched out here a reasonable scenario where you have the same share going back to Venezuela as baseline. And then you've got an escrow account, which the president has said he wants to use both for the benefit of the United States and the Venezuelan people.
Yeah, we don't know what the actual terms will look like. We are still waiting to hear about conditions and guarantees, for example. And it's possible that all of the barrels sold might go through the United States, and therefore the disposition might look a little different in how it turns out. But there is theoretically a cooperative surplus generated by this mechanism of action that could be split and divided.
And does this kind of scenario, how does that affect the balance of the different constituencies we've got here in the United States? So how do producers, how do refiners act, or how are they incentivized? Are they happy with a scenario like this?
I don't know about happy or sad. I think if you work in the oil industry, you probably keep your emotions in check, especially in weeks like this one. But if you look at where the additional volumes benefit the downstream, we talked about that already. The question is, what about the upstream?
Right.
You know, is there something you could do with these revenues, for example, that would assuage some of the concerns of producers who are saying, wait, there's additional supply coming to a relatively saturated market. We don't feel great about that. And the answer could be yes. An interesting thing that Secretary Wright said at the Goldman Energy Conference, where he was speaking a couple of days ago, Wednesday, was that he thought that there needed to be more investment in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, more refilling of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but he couldn't get the revenues out of Congress. They tried, and they didn't get very much, a paltry 171 million instead of the 20 billion he'd originally sought. But there might be another way. Well, Joseph, you on this very show here on Energy Shots in October said, what about using Venezuelan oil for the SPR? Now, there's some challenges putting Venezuelan oil into the SPR. It's heavy enough and dense enough, you might not ever get it out.
What's a chemical engineering detail between friends, Kevin?
Right, but there's another way.
Yeah.
You sell those heavy sour barrels, generate money, use that money to buy medium sour barrels that come from U.S. producers, and now there's an SPR put available. Essentially downside protection on price for producers when the price falls below a threshold, as the Biden administration originally designed, then you will buy barrels for the SPR, procure for the benefit of the American people, but also provide the incentive to produce at the upstream so that activity in the U.S. oil patch doesn't slow down as much.
So we can you move yourself toward a scenario where this revenue could be used in an escrow account clearly to the benefit of the United States and our energy security by refilling the SPR, which historical rates of refill say that you could do it about 100,000 barrels per day. The volumes and potential volumes we're talking about could easily cover those kinds of flows, but you're not necessarily expropriating resources under a model where things are selling at higher prices.
Yeah, if we were going to take our hypothetical $10 million a day, which again, hypothetical, and devote it entirely to $60 barrel purchases of medium sour grades for the SPR, it'd be about 166,000 barrels per day, which is well within the parameters for fill rates. That's historically, since the refill began, we've had that a few times, a few months. The nameplate capacity of the SPR is much more above that, but for technical and practical reasons, probably they wouldn't get much above 200 or 300,000 even at peak. But yes, we could absolutely do that. So the disposition of existing oil. Now, to be very clear, the Secretary has not said he would do this. Here on Energy Shots, we explore ideas, we talk about data, we consider concepts, and I think sometimes bravely predict, often accurately, it seems. Great prediction from October for you. But there's also the future barrels discussion, which I think is still pretty important.
Well, that's where we wanted to kind of close our discussion today, Kevin, because we're having this conversation on Friday morning. Friday afternoon, oil executives are meeting with the president in the White House to talk about what this reopening might actually look like. How are we going to get investment into Venezuela to increase barrels and achieve, if not what we've talked about, a similar kind of scenario? What's your read on what we might see this afternoon?
Well, I think it's going to be a complicated meeting in a lot of ways. A lot could change between now and then. For example, the Supreme Court, sometime shortly after we finish this podcast, could decide that the president's tariffs are illegal using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That might make the president a little upset and could make a testy president looking very specifically for a win in the meeting. And last night on Fox News, and then early this morning, the president put out what he wants to hear from executives. He wants a magic number of $100 billion in investment. Now, I'm not sure what time frame or in what capacity he's looking for that number, but he's got it in his head that these very significant capital outlays are going to be necessary. I think that's true. And I suspect that he's going to want to hear that from the companies in some form when he meets with the executives this afternoon. For the executives, though, there's a couple of considerations. Practically speaking, first of all, you're going to want to know what the risks are and what the incentives and the reimbursement package might look like. You're going to want to understand that, because if you're making an investment in the corporate boardroom, you're making an investment based on the risk-adjusted return on invested capital.
Right.
And before you make that investment, you're going to want to know what the risks and the return look like. And so I suspect they may want to say they are exploring or looking into it with great enthusiasm. Some of them probably have risk profiles, or they might even say yes outright. But for some companies who have been exerting a lot of capital discipline, showing that they've been minding their P's and Q's on spending, they're going to want to be cautious about telling Wall Street that they're going into Venezuela and going in a big way at $60 a barrel crude oil price.
And what do you think are the key things that oil executives, when they are meeting with the president, who's going to say to them, do it for the country? They're going to be looking at, they're looking at global markets. Are they looking at coking capacity? Are they looking at just the ability to get on the ground and operate safely and responsibly? What are the key factors they're going to be considering?
Well, I think different companies are going to have different perspectives based on their history, based on their technology, and frankly, based on their sense of opportunity, what's in their portfolio and what they think they might be able to make use of. There's a lot of ways to play in this too. It's not just a matter of getting into Venezuela and helping produce oil. There's diluent to dilute the heavy oil so that it can be moved to upgrading and export, selling that. Services, technology services to help upgrade and repair initially, and then ultimately expand the Venezuelan oil patch. Very significant opportunity there. So different kinds of companies trading and marketing those barrels. Other companies are going to play a role in that. All of them will have different perspectives on it based on where they fit into the value chain and where they are in terms of individual risk profiles and portfolios.
And what's one last thing that you're watching as this situation develops over the next 2 weeks?
Well, it's interesting because Secretary Rubio laid out a three-phase plan, essentially stabilization, recovery, and transition to democracy. And President Trump made it much simpler. He essentially wants to get the barrels flowing before the democracy gets going. But a lot is predicated on the oil industry recovery in Venezuela. And so understanding what those plans look like, the key dates and milestones, and the structure and sort of the concepts that are going to be brought to bear to encourage investment, I think is going to be extremely important.
Kevin, there's no person I want to talk about this issue more than with you and our audience here at Energy Shots. Thank you so much for joining me in this endeavor. Colleagues joining online, thank you so much for your viewership. We welcome your comments, we welcome your responses, and we'll see you next time on Energy Shots. We hope you have an energetic day.
All right. So it gets a little complicated than just shipping Venezuelan oil to the United States. All right. And the petrol coke capacity is super important to understand here. And that's a byproduct of the actual heavy crude. Your refineries have to be able to be fine-tuned to be able to process it. And that one of the byproducts of that pet coke is the ability to smelt aluminum. But you also have fuel. You can use it as a fuel source for furnaces. So this is going to help with heavy manufacturing, heavy industry. Please go to my store, the-studio-reykjavik.com. Help support the work that I do. All these videos are for free. Please go to the store, the-studio-reykjavik.com, and get the collagen. This is dual purpose. It's going to help with the health of your skin, your hair, and your nails. Help with your musculature, your joint health, and also your bone density. Take it every day. That's a month's supply. Also, get the Gladiator Barley. This will help to build muscle, bring down inflammation, detoxify your body, and soak up free radicals through superoxide dismutase. When you take this every day and you do some resistance training, you're slowing down the aging process. When you're bringing down inflammation, you're going to be able to recover quicker after your workout. And when you're soaking up those free radicals, bringing down inflammation, and detoxifying your body regularly, you're boosting up your immune system, your endocrine system, your cardiovascular health will improve. Why? Because by bringing down inflammation and soaking up free radicals, you're reducing plaque formation. And the microenvironment around your neurons will improve with less inflammation and soaking up those free radicals. So please get the Gladiator Barley. Take it every day. It's a month's supply. And we're in the winter season, the cold season, and moving into the spring where there's going to be allergies. please go to my store and get the structural nano silver drops. Very high quality. You can get it in blueberry, honey and lemon, and in cherry flavor. The moment you have that throat irritation, take them right away to mitigate the problem. It's really important. Plus, this will improve the health of your oral cavity and your oral pharynx. Please go to my store, get a few bags for your household. Use discount 5 and you get $5 off any order. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.